Before we dive into one of the most fascinating and misunderstood stories in American history, I want to ask you something. If this kind of content speaks to you, if you love the raw, unfiltered truth behind the legends we were taught to believe, then hit that subscribe button right now and leave a like on this video. It means the world to this channel, and it helps us keep bringing you stories that Hollywood would never dare to tell the way they actually happened. Now, let's talk about Billy the Kid.
His name alone conjures images of a young gunslinger with wild eyes, a crooked smile, and a pistol always ready to speak when words ran out. Billy the Kid. The very phrase sounds like something pulled from the pages of a dime novel, because in many ways it was. But behind the myth, behind the yellow journalism and the frontier folklore and the dime store legends, there was a real human being. A boy, really, a teenager who never quite got the chance to become a man, living in one of the most brutal, lawless, and unforgiving landscapes America had ever seen, the New Mexico Territory in the 1870s and 1880s, and the story of who he really was, not the monster, not the comic book outlaw, but the actual flesh and blood person, is far more heartbreaking, far more complex, and far more American than anything you've ever been told. His real name was William Henry McCarty Jr., though he'd go by many names throughout his short life: Henry Antrim, William Bonney, and finally the one that would outlive every version of him, Billy the Kid. He was born somewhere around 1859, most likely in New York City, to an Irish immigrant mother named Catherine McCarty. From the very beginning, his life was shaped by instability and loss. His father was either dead or gone before Billy could even form a memory of him. His mother, Catherine, was a fierce and devoted woman who dragged her two sons, Billy and his older brother Joe, across the country in search of something better. She was sick, possibly with tuberculosis, and she was looking for dry air, a new start, and maybe a man who could give her children a future. She found the first two in New Mexico. The third one, that future, would prove far more elusive for young Billy. Catherine married a man named William Antrim in Santa Fe in 1873, and the family settled in Silver City, New Mexico. For a brief golden moment, it looked like stability. Billy went to school. By all accounts, he was sharp, charming, funny, a kid who made friends easily and loved to read. His teacher remembered him as one of the brightest students she ever had. But the good times didn't last. Catherine died of tuberculosis in September 1874, when Billy was just 14 or 15 years old, and just like that, the last anchor in his life was gone. His stepfather, William Antrim, was a decent enough man, but had no real interest in raising two boys on his own. He essentially abandoned them. Billy and Joe were farmed out to different boarding houses in Silver City. For Joe, this meant a quiet fade into obscurity. For Billy, it meant the beginning of a spiral that would end with a bullet. The first time Billy got in trouble with the law, it wasn't for anything violent. It wasn't even really his idea. He was 16 years old when a man named George Schaefer, nicknamed Sombrero Jack, talked him into hiding some stolen laundry. It was a stupid, petty crime, the kind of thing a teenager does when he's bored and hungry and doesn't think about consequences. But the local sheriff didn't see it that way, and Billy was thrown in jail. He escaped 2 days later by wriggling up through a chimney, and that escape, that first desperate dash for freedom, set the tone for everything that would come after. Billy the Kid would spend the rest of his life running, running from the law, running from the past, running from a system that had decided from the moment his mother died and left him alone in the desert that he didn't deserve a fair shot. After the escape, Billy made his way to Arizona, and that's where things got truly dangerous. He was working as a ranch hand and a gambler, doing what young men with no family and no money did in the frontier, surviving however he could. Then came the encounter with a man named Frank Windy Cahill, a blacksmith with a reputation for bullying younger men. The details are disputed, but what's not disputed is the outcome. Cahill had been riding Billy, humiliating him publicly, and on the night of August 17th, 1877, things came to a head. There was a fight, a gun went off, and Cahill was dead. Billy fled before he could be arrested. He was 17 years old and he had his first kill. Was it self-defense? Almost certainly. The witnesses at the scene said Cahill had gotten on top of Billy and was beating him when Billy managed to get his gun free. But the law didn't much care about context out there. A man was dead. Billy was young, poor, and had no one to speak for him. So he ran. He made his way back to New Mexico, and it's here that the legend of Billy the Kid truly begins, not in some grand moment of villainy, but in the middle of a cattle war between two powerful factions of wealthy men fighting over land, money, and political control of Lincoln County. On one side, you had Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, a pair of merchants and ranchers who essentially ran the county like a private empire, backed by corrupt politicians and a compliant sheriff named William Brady. On the other side, you had an English rancher named John Tunstall, who had come to New Mexico with his partner Alexander McSween to break that monopoly and build something fairer. Billy found work with Tunstall, and in that soft-spoken, educated Englishman, he seems to have found something rare, a man who treated him with genuine respect and kindness. Tunstall saw potential in Billy. He paid him fair wages, talked to him like an equal, and made him feel, maybe for the first time since his mother died, like he mattered. Then, on February 18, 1878, a posse working for Dolan and Sheriff Brady rode out and killed John Tunstall in cold blood, shot him from his horse, and then shot his horse on top of him. Billy was nearby, close enough to hear the shots, but not close enough to stop it, and something inside him changed that day. He had watched the one man who'd ever truly believed in him get murdered by a corrupt system that protected the powerful and crushed everyone else. The grief, by all accounts, was genuine and total. Billy reportedly said that Tunstall was the only man who had ever treated him kindly and like he was his own son, and that he would make every one of his killers pay. This wasn't the cold declaration of a sociopath. This was a teenage boy who had lost everything again and had nowhere to put the rage except into action. What followed was the Lincoln County War, and Billy the Kid was right in the middle of it. He joined a group called the Regulators, men loyal to Tunstall and McSween, deputized at various points by a rival legal authority and determined to bring Tunstall's killers to justice. The problem was the killers were being protected by the law. Sheriff Brady was in Dolan's pocket. The courts were compromised. The whole system was rotten from the inside out. So the regulators did what men did when the law failed them in the frontier. They took matters into their own hands. They hunted down the men involved in Tunstall's murder and killed them. Billy was present at several of these killings and he almost certainly pulled the trigger on some of them. But it's crucial to understand the context. These weren't random acts of violence. These were targeted killings of men who had murdered his employer and friend in broad daylight and walked away free because money and politics protected them. In a world where justice was something rich men bought and poor men never saw, the regulators were the only law that meant anything. The war culminated in a 5-day battle in Lincoln in July 1878 when a large Dolan posse, backed by U.S. Army soldiers, surrounded the McSween house where Billy and the other regulators were sheltering. The house was set on fire. McSween himself was killed in the chaos trying to negotiate a surrender. Billy, with a handful of survivors, made a desperate, seemingly suicidal run through the burning darkness and the gunfire and somehow, incredibly, made it out alive. It was the kind of moment that becomes legend. A teenage boy running through flames while soldiers and hired guns tried to cut him down, emerging from the other side not just alive but defiant. The Lincoln County War officially ended that night, but Billy the Kid's war with the law was just beginning. After Lincoln, Billy was a wanted man. Without the political backing of the Tunstall McSween faction, without a job or a home, he drifted into genuine outlawry, rustling cattle, gambling, living by his wits and his reputation. But even in this period, something interesting emerges from the historical record. The people who actually knew Billy rarely described him as cruel or sadistic. They described him as funny, generous, loyal to his friends, a man who code switched effortlessly between English and Spanish and was beloved by the Hispanic communities of New Mexico, who called him El Chivato, the Kid Goat, with genuine affection. He danced at fandangos, he played cards and laughed loudly, he helped families who were struggling. He was, by all accounts, someone you'd want to have a beer with, right up until you crossed him or threatened someone he cared about. The mythology of Billy the Kid as a cold-blooded killer of 21 men, one for every year of his life, is almost entirely fictional. It was invented and promoted by dime novelists and eventually by a ghost-written autobiography that appeared after his death and claimed to tell the true story but was more fiction than fact. The real number of men Billy personally killed is probably closer to 4, possibly as many as 9 if you count disputed engagements during the Lincoln County War. Still not a small number, still enough to make him dangerous, but a far cry from the serial monster of legend. What the mythology was really doing, what it had always done with frontier outlaws, was taking a complicated, sympathetic human story and flattening it into something simpler and more satisfying. A villain, a killer, a cautionary tale. It's easier to dismiss Billy the Kid if he's a monster. It's a lot harder if he's a teenage orphan who watched his only protector get murdered and decided that in a world without justice, he'd make his own. The man who would eventually bring Billy down was Pat Garrett, a tall, ambitious former bartender who had been elected sheriff of Lincoln County in November 1880. Garrett and Billy actually knew each other. They had ridden together, gambled together, possibly shared meals and campfires, which makes what happened next feel less like justice and more like betrayal. Garrett tracked Billy relentlessly through the winter of 1880 and 1881, eventually capturing him at Stinking Springs in December 1880. Billy was tried for the murder of Sheriff Brady, one of the more legally complicated killings in his history, since Brady had been a corrupt lawman working for the men who murdered his friend and was sentenced to hang. It was a death sentence as much about politics as about justice. The new governor of New Mexico Territory, Lew Wallace, had promised Billy a pardon in exchange for testimony against the Dolan faction, a promise Billy had actually fulfilled. And then Wallace had broken his word, leaving Billy to face the gallows alone. What Billy did next became the stuff of pure legend. Held in the Lincoln County Courthouse under heavy guard, awaiting the gallows, Billy somehow, and historians still debate exactly how, got hold of a gun. He killed his 2 guards, broke his leg irons, and escaped on horseback into the mountains. It was the boldest jailbreak in the history of the American West, and rather than flee the territory entirely, Billy stayed. He went back to Fort Sumner, back to the community that had sheltered him, back to the woman he loved, a local girl named Polita Maxwell, some say, or possibly others in that tight-knit Hispanic community where he was not a feared outlaw but a familiar, beloved figure. It was that loyalty, that refusal to run away from the people he cared about, that ultimately cost him his life. Pat Garrett came for him in the night of July 14th, 1881. He'd gotten a tip about where Billy was staying and crept into the darkened bedroom of Pete Maxwell's house at Fort Sumner. Billy walked in from outside unarmed, asking, "Quien es? Quien es? Who's there? Who's there?" And Garrett fired twice in the darkness. The first shot hit Billy in the chest, above the heart. He was dead before he hit the floor. He was 21 years old, and within months the legend began to take over from the man. Pat Garrett himself would write, or rather have written for him, a sensationalized biography that turned Billy into a monster and himself into a hero. The dime novelists followed, the newspapers followed, and the real William Henry McCarty Jr., the funny, charming, tragically orphaned boy from the frontier, disappeared beneath the weight of all those stories. Here's what's worth sitting with, though. Billy the Kid didn't start out as an outlaw. He started out as a kid with nothing. No father, a dying mother, a stepfather who didn't want him, a society that offered boys in his position exactly 2 options: submit and starve, or fight and maybe survive. He chose to fight. He chose loyalty over safety, action over passivity, justice, as he understood it, over the corrupt official version that had let his friends' killers walk free. Were those the right choices? Not always. Did he do things he shouldn't have? Yes. Were their innocent lives touched by the violence that swirled around him? Probably. But the portrait of Billy the Kid as a bloodthirsty psychopath is a lie built to serve the interests of the people who wanted him dead and the newspapers that wanted to sell papers. The truth is messier and more human. A boy shaped by abandonment and poverty and grief, navigating a world that had decided he didn't matter, and insisting again and again with a gun in his hand and a grin on his face that he did. The American West was not the romanticized landscape of clean duels and righteous lawmen that Hollywood sold us for 100 years. It was a brutal, chaotic place where power belonged to whoever had the money to buy it and the violence to enforce it. Men like Dolan and Murphy ruled through corruption and intimidation. Men like Sheriff Brady served the highest bidder. Men like Governor Lew Wallace made promises they never intended to keep. Billy the Kid was not a product of his own moral failures. He was a product of a system that failed him at every turn, and then punished him for adapting to that failure in the only ways he knew how. There is something deeply painfully American about that story. It's the story of a country that preaches equality and delivers exploitation, that builds myths about rugged individualism while grinding the actual individuals into dust. In the decades and centuries since his death, Billy the Kid has become one of the most written about, filmed, debated, and reimagined figures in American history. He has been played by dozens of actors, the subject of hundreds of books, the inspiration for ballets and operas and folk songs. Various men have claimed over the years to be the real Billy, to have survived that night in Fort Sumner, to have fooled Garrett into shooting someone else. None of those claims have ever held up to serious historical scrutiny. Billy died that night, but the thing that keeps people coming back to his story, the thing that makes him resonate across generations and cultures, is not the violence, it's the human story underneath it. The orphan who refused to disappear, the outlaw who inspired loyalty, the boy who, in a world determined to tell him he was nothing, kept insisting he was something, right up until the darkness took him. What does it mean that we keep telling his story? Maybe it means that some part of us recognizes what Billy the Kid was really up against. Not just corrupt sheriffs and cattle barons, but the fundamental unfairness of a world that sorts people into winners and losers before they even know the rules. Maybe it means that we understand, on some gut level, that the mythology of the Wild West, the clean moral universe of good guys and bad guys, of law and order, of civilization triumphing over chaos, was always a story the powerful told about themselves to justify what they'd done to everyone else. And Billy the Kid, whatever else he was the thing that story needed to erase. A reminder that the outlaws weren't always the villains, and the law wasn't always on the side of justice. He was 21 years old when he died. Think about that, 21. Most people at 21 are figuring out what they want to major in or celebrating their first legal drink. Billy the Kid had already survived the death of his mother, abandonment by his stepfather, a jailbreak, a cattle war, a burning house, a cavalry ambush, another jailbreak, and a decade of surviving on the frontier with nothing but his wits and his reputation. He had already become a legend. He had already outlived the man who taught him what kindness looked like, the political movement that gave him a cause, and the legal promise that might have given him a future. By the time Pat Garrett's bullet found him in that dark room in Fort Sumner, Billy the Kid had already lived more lives than most men see in a full 60 years, and he faced the end the same way he faced everything else, without seeing it coming and without time to say goodbye. So was he a killer? Yes. Was he a legend? Absolutely. Was he a scapegoat? More than history has ever given him credit for, but more than any of those things, Billy the Kid was a person, a specific, irreplaceable, complicated human being who deserved better than the world gave him. He deserved a father who stayed, a mother who lived, a governor who kept his word, a society that offered poor orphaned boys more than two choices, surrender or die fighting. He got none of those things, and so he became what the frontier made him, fast, fierce, loyal to the death, and gone too soon. The real Billy the Kid was not a monster, he was a mirror, and what he reflected back at the America of his time, and maybe at ours, was not pretty, but it was true.
If this story moved you, if you felt something hearing the truth about William Henry McCarty Jr., the boy behind the myth, then please take a second and subscribe to this channel and drop a like on this video. We are committed to digging into the real stories, the ones that get buried under legend and politics and the convenience of simple narratives. Every like, every subscriber, every share tells us to keep going, and it helps more people find the history they were never taught in school. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.